Imagine eating the same 3 meals every day for the rest of your life. Sounds pretty boring, right? Well, that's exactly what many of us do with our news diet. We stick to the same 3 or 4 sources, never venturing beyond our comfort zone. But just as a diverse diet is crucial for our physical health, a varied news diet is essential for our intellectual health. That's why I use Ground News. It's a website and app that's like a buffet for your brain, offering a veritable smorgasbord of perspectives on current events. They even have a blind spot feed that highlights stories your usual sources might be overlooking. By diversifying your news intake, Ground News helps you think more critically about current events and your own beliefs. So go check out ground.news, and if you like what you find, use my link in the show notes to get 15% off any subscription. You're helping to support this podcast and promote media literacy. And now, on to the episode. I'm your host, Michael Callahan. This is Where We Go Next. And we humans, we're social creatures who seek belonging. So we have a natural tendency to form groups, and from that, group identities. But when does pride in our group become a trap that limits our own growth? Our guest this week shares her journey from once embracing the often limiting strictures of collective identities to developing a more complex, independent sense of self. Salomé Sibonex is a writer, artist, and co-founder of The Black Sheep, a publication that frees people to take the path less traveled. She's given talks at FreedomFest and LibertyCon on how creative freedom allows us all to forge our own path, if we dare. Salomé, thanks so much for joining us.
I'm so excited to be here.
Well, I'm glad that we're both glad that you're here. Your work, quote, highlights the human desire for myth, meaning, and connection as tools for overcoming our cultural conflicts, end quote. You write and talk at length about identity, how it informs who you are, and how it informs how we see and understand each other. That's a favorite topic of mine as well, and one I'd love to explore with you today. So if you had to describe yourself in, let's say, a single sentence, how would you?
Oh my gosh, I hate questions like this. Okay, I'm leaving. That's it. It's so hard. These are the kind of questions where it's like, what's your favorite movie? And immediately my mind goes blank. Okay, if I had to describe myself in one sentence, okay, I'm going to give it my best shot.
No wrong answers.
I would describe myself as a curious, creative, conflicted, and complex human being on an ever-changing journey that is life.
I like that. It leaned into adjectives, which was helping to describe how you see yourself. And I think your self-description so closely ties to so much of your journey. What you talk and write about has been driven by your own experiences, rejecting labels, redefining yourself, discovering yourself.
Yeah, I agree. That's likely where I developed my allergy to certain labels. I went through a period of time where it was like anybody trying to figure out who I was, what I believed in, what I cared about, what I wanted to do with my life. And that was a confusing time for me as kind of like a young adult in my late teens and early 20s. And labels that have gotten really popular now, like I'm a feminist, or I'm a socialist, or I'm non-binary, or I'm bi, or I'm this political group, whatever it is. You even have them now like I'm neurodivergent. It's just like labels all the way down now. I never remember seeing such a proliferation of identity markers when I was in high school. They really exploded when I was in my mid-20s. And I found that these were traps because for a person like me who was trying to figure out who I was, what I believed in, what I wanted to do, these labels seemed like shortcuts. And they made it really easy to plaster over all the questions and conflicts within me and just try to fit a caricature of a feminist, a caricature of a leftist. Then suddenly you have a ready-made community. You have ready-made ideas. You have all the instructions on what you should believe, who you should ally yourself with, what kind of things you value, everything. It's like this ready-made personality. And when you're not really sure of who you are, that can seem like a perfect fix. But it took me some time to realize it was a trap. It actually held me back for a while. It basically took me off my path of figuring out who I really was and took me down this detour where I realized, oh, these are things that people think I should be. That doesn't really encapsulate who I actually am.
How helpful are labels when they are detached from verbs? If you say that you're a writer, but you don't write, then you're not a writer. But you could say, I'm compassionate, but if your compassion is detached from a verb and that compassion doesn't act out in any kind of way, like to use a stereotypical example, you go to a soup kitchen every Saturday, or you help children who are learning to write or their ESL or whatever that might be. I think a lot of what you're kind of talking about, whether it's in the former quote unquote social justice circles that you found yourself in a decade or so ago, or when it comes to whether or not, a mom or a dad, how meaningful is that label when it's detached from an actual verb that demonstrates what kind of father or mother or activist that person is? It seems like that's what's happening a lot these days, where someone can label themselves as something, but it's detached from action, and they're trying to reap the reward of that label without actually having to do anything.
Yeah, I think that that's definitely what's going on. And I think that that's part of what was a problem for me, is that I thought the label was the thing, that you just kind of call yourself the thing and say you believe in the thing, and things will change, things will happen. One of the things that led me to be so disillusioned with the kind of like activist communities I found myself in was the decoupling of living with beliefs.
Words in action.
Yeah, there was a lot of talk about compassion and empathy and inclusion and equality. But in practice, I saw people constantly criticizing others and creating division and insulting people if they didn't agree and excluding people for the slightest infractions of just thinking differently about something. And eventually it came to a head when I started to see people justify acts of property destruction and even violence if it was in the name of something they believed in. But the thing that they said they believed in was equality and a better future and empathy, these things that aren't brought about by random acts of destruction and violence. And that was a big awakening for me, was to drop the naivety of thinking that just calling yourself something makes you the thing. It sounds very childish in some ways, but it's actually very profound. And I've found that a lot of the most profound things seem very simple. And it's because it's not an intellectual realization you have to have. It's something deeper. It's a felt realization. It's something you learn almost in your full body, as opposed to just being like, oh, I know people lie. But do you though? Do you actually live in a way that accounts for the fact that people often say things and don't mean it? And so I found that, I always knew that people lie or people think they believe things but don't live up to it. I had to really start looking for that in a much more serious and mature way. And that's what led me to look at action and how that goes along with the beliefs that we claim to hold. And I found that you have the reverse also. You have people that don't fit the beliefs. They won't say the right slogans. They won't say that they're part of this group or that community or whatever it is, but they're really good people. And they actually bring lightness and joy and support wherever they go. But they're politically incorrect. They say the wrong things. They don't know the latest ideas or the right jargon for something. But their actions actually are what is making the difference there. And so I think in some ways, social media particularly, but media as well, has led people to be much more optics driven and much more narrative driven, as opposed to being able to look at the real world and assess, well, yeah, Johnny always says this, but you can't trust him because when it comes down to it, he's untrustworthy because his actions prove otherwise, despite him saying he cares about being trustworthy. We don't really have that in the same way because oftentimes we're interacting with strangers and we're reading about the news that's happening in places where we can't observe anything with people that we don't know and can't observe. So I really wonder how much we've begun to lose that understanding that it's not enough to just hold beliefs and to say you care about something, but it's how we live up to those things and the actions we take in pursuit of those things that really makes the difference.
Your mom immigrated here from Cuba, and you were born and raised in Miami, Florida. So in the spirit, and I hope you will humor me here, in those kind of simple truths, I want to ask a few simple questions over the course of this conversation. What does it mean to you to be first generation?
It's a great question because it's changed what it means to me. It used to mean something more superficial, I think, to me. Now, I don't think about it that much. It's not like I wake up and I'm like, another day being a first generation immigrant. It's not something that's conscious to me in that way. But I do find that it's a wellspring of motivation and of a healthy pride. It's a little easier for me to be grateful and to appreciate the mundane in my life when I know that only a generation ago, my family lacked these things. And so I think in some ways, it's a driver. I think that's what it is. It's a source of drive.
I'm Irish on my father's side. I'm Armenian on my mother's side, both pretty far removed. My Irish ancestors came over around 1870. My Armenian ancestors came over around 1920 after the few who survived the genocide were able to make it over here. So growing up in my hometown of Pleasanton in Northern California, what it meant to be Armenian there and what it means to be Armenian here in Los Angeles are two very different things. Because I think my mom, my sister, and I were the only ethnic Armenians in all of Pleasanton, probably in the 90s. That is, of course, changed now. But then moving here to Los Angeles, I mean, you can't really throw a pebble in any direction without hitting an Armenian. And most of the Armenians who live here are either from Armenia or are the children of Armenian immigrants. So for me to come here was a culture shock as someone who doesn't speak Armenian, as someone who's never been to Armenia, as someone who is 3 generations removed. So how I thought of and think of myself as Armenian as a child of the 90s growing up in Pleasanton versus being here in Los Angeles are two very different things. What does it mean to you to be Cuban American in Miami? And what does it mean to be Cuban American outside of Miami?
Yeah, that's a great question. So you're not Cuban if you're Cuban American. It's very poignant in Miami because there are people that have really recently arrived from Cuba, do not speak English, don't have a connection to American culture in the way that someone like me who was born in Miami, despite being raised in a predominantly Cuban area as well, has. And so it's a different culture. It's kind of funny. It's fun in a way because you have one foot in one world and another foot in another world. And that hyphen is very much a symbol of that. It's something beautiful in a way. It's kind of like that original melting pot idea that you can take the good that's come from your background with you, but you can also adopt the good of a new culture, a new place. And as you join that culture, you strengthen it and it strengthens you. I've found that there are differences. My Cubanness is heightened when I get away from Miami because then I'm the more Cuban person usually. Whereas in Miami, I'm often the less Cuban person. So when I'm in a different situation like that, a different location, it's funny. It's like it's almost becomes more of a novelty. Like people just care more, they're like, oh, you're Cuban. Oh, what about this? What about that? And I'm like, nobody cares at all in Miami. I'm the last person you're going to ask about Cuban anything because there's people that just got there from Cuba. You're going to ask them about Cuban stuff. And so it's funny how it becomes like It's like you change roles. Like when I'm in Miami, it's like, sit down and be quiet and listen to the actual Cubans. And when I'm not in Miami, it's like, please tell us your experience and your insight into Cuban culture. I'm like, wow, these are definitely two different audiences. I think that's ultimately what changes it. I'm still the same person. That's the funny thing about it. It's the context that changes how I'm perceived.
Oh, 100%. Yeah. I mean, when I'm not in LA and, the average person hears that I'm Armenian, there's this one comment that stood out to me. Someone said when they heard that I was Irish and Armenian, they said, wow, what an exotic combo. I mean, I wasn't offended or anything, but I was just like, I guess I never looked at my mom and dad as some kind of, hearing exotic almost makes you think of like, ooh, a cool fusion dish.
Right.
No Armenian here in Los Angeles would call it exotic because, to your point, when you are surrounded by that thing, whether it's a culture, a people, a geography, it's just normal. It's the air that you breathe. It's the water you swim in. But all of a sudden, if you're the fish that left the water and is crawling around on land, yeah, you look pretty exotic to anyone who's never seen a fish before.
Yeah, especially when I've traveled abroad. I remember being in Prague, and I don't even know how this person found out, but the owner of the restaurant we were at in Český Krumlov, like it's a small...
That's where my wife and I went for our honeymoon last December.
No way! Oh, I love that. That's so funny. Go figure. And I'm here like, hope he knows what I'm talking about. I'm going to butcher this name.
Do you remember where specifically, like, was it a restaurant? Or, I mean, I would probably have been there.
Yeah, it's small. Gosh, I can't remember what the restaurant was.
It's okay. If you remember later, you can email me.
Yeah, it's been a while. It was a long time ago. But I remember that the owner found out, I don't even know how. I think he asked where I was from. And I said, Miami. And then he was like, wait, are you Cuban? And I said, yeah, I'm Cuban American. I was born there, but my mom is Cuban from Cuba. And he was so excited. He wanted to ask all these questions. He's very into it. And I think that was because Eastern Europe has kind of like a history with Cuba. A lot of the products that were shipped to Cuba at one point were from the Czech Republic and from the Soviet Union. So, it's funny to go to such a faraway country from Miami and then have a unique connection there because of my heritage. But that's, again, this kind of like the context that you're in changes the perception.
You co-founded, co-edit, and write for the Black Sheep Substack, a publication, quote, dedicated to highlighting the individuals who are willing to stand up to collective dysfunction, end quote. How would you define a black sheep?
I would say that a black sheep is someone who has discovered something useful that the group they are challenging is not quite ready to hear yet. So the black sheep is often this like early to something kind of person who thinks differently, who's willing to experiment, and who's just more interested in discovery than they are in going along with the group or kind of like that peacemaking, go along to get along attitude. And so black sheep is often people that invent things or like come up with new styles of art or things like this that requires someone that's a little more interested in just going down the rabbit hole they're interested in than waiting for others to catch up with them.
From that Substack, quote, history is full of black sheep who chose to do what was right when the herd was wrong. Whether it's in your culture, workplace, school, or personal relationships, everyone will face moments when they must choose between conforming to the group or standing alone for the truth, end quote. Can you tell us about a moment that is separate from politics or the culture war or whatever we're calling that these days? Can you tell us about a moment when you felt pressure to conform and you did?
I have this fuzzy memory, but the fuzziness of it, I want to get through it because it's an important one. I think it's one of those childhood memories that just kind of stick with you and are probably formative. I remember being in school and having the answer to something, but the school kids that I was with were like, that's not like, oh no, we don't think so, whatever. And so I just was like, okay, it's probably wrong. And it was right. And someone else in the classroom went on to be like, what if we did this? And got all the glory. And I distinctly remember this kind of like childhood revelation of, oh, wow, but I was right. I was misled. Why did I listen to them? I would have been the one that was able to help. I know that that has happened to me on some other occasions because it's very much a function of it's a normal human experience to doubt yourself when everyone else is doubting as well. I believe there's an experiment that even tested this. I can't remember the name. I want to say it's the Milgram experiment, but I could be wrong. That could be the one with the electric shocks.
This might be the one you're talking about. I recently had on a social psychology researcher by the name of Steve Rathje. He specifically explores how polarization and intergroup conflict interact with social media. And there was this one study that he references on his TikTok. And I think you're probably thinking of this one or a variation of it, where there's a woman in a waiting room and she thinks that she's waiting for like a focus group, but the actual thing that she's being tested on is happening in the lobby and she just doesn't know it because everyone else in the lobby is a paid actor. And what happens is smoke, really from like a fog machine or whatever, but like smoke starts to fill the lobby and everyone else in the lobby doesn't react. You see video of her. She looks to her left. She looks to her right. No one else is reacting. So she doesn't get up. She doesn't leave. She just stays there as the room fills with what she believes is smoke.
Wow.
And it's just a great example of how even when something feels very wrong, if you're surrounded by people who aren't reacting or they're doing the thing that you think is wrong, but everyone else thinks is right, you feel this feeling to conform.
That's an incredible experiment. I'm actually thinking of a different experiment that proves the same thing. All the participants, except for one, were paid actors, and they all gave the wrong answer about how long a piece of string was. And so they measured how the variability between when there were other people that said the string is this length, and that was the accurate length, versus the time when everybody said the string was the wrong length, and to what degree that would influence the person being tested, their answer. And it's a huge amount of influence. And that's a natural part of human evolution, is that we look around us for social cues. That other experiment, the smoke one, is just a great example of that. It's so funny, but that's exactly it. And so to some degree, the black sheep is a fascinating symbol to me because that's usually the person that doesn't do that. That's the person that actually goes with their gut or just doesn't have that sense of like, someone else probably has it figured out, or, well, if no one else is questioning this, then it's probably fine. They're the ones that say, does anybody see that smoke? And that's often the person that can allow for some really useful change and highlight things that everyone else is overlooking or ignoring. And so I've had to battle that. I've had people ask me like, oh, well, I think if you need to learn how to be a black sheep, then maybe it's not for you. And it's like, no, I highly disagree with that because I had to learn how to be a black sheep. I think a lot of us have inner conflict around being disagreeable and offending or upsetting other people, but also wanting to be truthful and wanting to say what we think. And when I was younger, that was a much bigger conflict for me because I was much more conflict averse. And so situations like that where I would find I was the only one questioning something, I tended to not want to go and put my neck out and say, I'm going to disagree with everybody. I'm going to do this anyway. And yeah, so that took a lot of time for me to develop more of an independent streak in that way.
When is it good to be a white sheep? When is it good to conform?
That's a great question. I think when you don't know what you're talking about or what you're doing, it may be safer and wiser to consider collective wisdom, to say, okay, a lot of people are doing it this way. I have no idea what to do. Maybe I should start there. There's a reason why people often do things the way they do. There's a reason why things are popular. Sometimes it's because it genuinely is a fine way to do the thing. Being a contrarian for the sake of being a contrarian isn't really the same as productive nonconformity. In my view, that kind of black sheep approach is an informed one. It's one where the person is very aware that they actually have figured out a better way to do something, or at least a more rewarding way for them. And they're going to pursue that despite it being unpopular. Whereas there's also just being a contrarian for the sake of it. And that can get you into a lot of trouble because You see that often in politics where people say, oh, if that's what that side believes, well, I'm going to run in the opposite direction. And that often just leads you to equal but opposite problems. So that kind of knee-jerk nonconformity, I don't think is very helpful. I think there's plenty of times where the common way of doing something is so because it's just fine. And so if it's like, oh, I'm going to cook a dish or something, it's why reinvent the wheel? If you don't actually know how to cook, you should start with the recipes that have already been cooked and tested and come out well. And then you can decide, you know what, I really didn't like that spice in it. What if I changed it? And so I think that kind of informed nonconformity is the sweet spot where it's not just running in the opposite direction for the sake of it, but it's just kind of being aware of when you're conforming, is it because you're afraid? Is it because you don't have the courage to go do the thing that you really feel you should? That's being motivated by fear. And that's often going to take you to like a comfort zone as opposed to a growth place. And so conformity that's like, I genuinely like doing the conformist thing. Awesome. Like if you genuinely feel called to do the thing that is most popular, that's just fine.
Yeah, it's a difficult balance, right? Because we love to celebrate the rebels here in America, the one person who goes against the grain and ends up being proven right somehow. But there's also the Chesterton's fence of it all. The idea that sometimes the fence is there because the people who put up the fence knew what they were doing. And tearing down that fence, or to use a more recent example, a statue, right? Sometimes tearing down that fence is actually the very thing you should avoid doing because you weren't sure why the fence was there in the first place. And so we love to be individualistic here in America. Hell, I love it too. I'm an American, right? But also, even just beyond the fact that we all need to follow laws for society to function, we also have cultural norms, the ways that we talk and act to each other in order for a society to function. There are so many ways on a day-to-day basis in which we all, either through collective action or cooperation, or just keeping up our respective Chesterton fences so society can work, there's all kinds of ways in which we kind of need to conform for the grease to actually move the wheels. But it's tough to balance that with the American ideal of individualism.
When I decided to get engaged, right, that is a very common, traditional, normie thing to do.
Yes.
And there was a younger version of me that thought, maybe I won't get married. Maybe that's not something I want. Why should I do that? Because everybody does it. And so that's kind of that like contrarian streak that doesn't really know why it's questioning. It's just questioning. And that can be fine. But when you couple that with action, that can be destructive. But when I got engaged, it was not conforming. I didn't decide to get engaged because I saw everybody else doing it. This is the popular thing to do. I guess it's right. It's because I genuinely wanted to do it. Because it's actually a good thing to do. It's actually good for you if you love someone and you want to be in that kind of monogamous, committed relationship. Getting engaged is helpful. And so I think that's maybe sometimes a misconception that people have about what it means to be a black sheep or a nonconformist or an individualist. It's not that you go around looking for every opportunity to just do things differently, but that you're not doing things because other people are pushing you to do it. You're doing things because you've actually thought through whether these things are genuinely the correct way to do things. And of course, this takes more from us because it's often easier for us to just look around, take those social cues and say, well, this is what I see everybody else doing. I guess that's what I'm going to do. But there's such a danger in that because so often you have people that go into careers, go into relationships, pick up all sorts of behaviors and ideas because they see other people doing it. And they think, well, it seems to be working for them. I guess I should do that. And oftentimes it's not working for the people that they're looking at either. They just don't see behind the scenes. This is an issue with lacking that kind of individual compass that we can develop. And you can develop that in many different ways. Some people have religion for that. They have their own articulated belief systems, culture. There's a lot of different ways that we fine-tune our individual compass. But at the end of the day, I think if you are consulting with that internal compass and you make a choice that is a common or popular choice, it's not really conforming because the primary driver was your conscious decision to make that choice rather than the desire to appease others.
It's not about rebellion for the sake of rebellion. It's, to go back to a word that you used to describe yourself, it's about being curious and specifically a first principles thinker.
Yes, that's what I'm obsessed with, is having a sound internal compass, and principles are the way that you do that. Whether you get your principles through a more complex belief system like religion, or you boil it down to the core principles and know what those actually are, we make decisions. And ultimately, they're always going to be some kind of expression of our belief system. But we can fine-tune the outcome we want if we're really in line with the compass we're using. And a lot of people do use conformity as their compass, like I did when I was younger. And it caused me a lot of problems because I was making choices based off of other people's internal compass, perhaps, assuming that they even made those choices based off their internal compass and weren't conforming to somebody else's internal compass. But the thing is, like, there's plenty of choices that I make now that are common and popular, but I check them out with my beliefs, my principles, that internal compass. And that allows me to be so much more certain that this is taking me in the direction I want to go, rather than looking around and saying, well, this is the path of least resistance, which is often what drives that desire to conform. It's not like, oh, I'm so excited to conform. It's more like it's so uncomfortable not to conform on this issue or in this way. And sometimes it's just easier. It's easier for us not to think deeply about something. And sometimes that's fine. It's not like we have the bandwidth to question every single thing. Like, it's funny, I thought about it the other day, how much we dress in kind of normal ways on average. Like, you go to the store and there's clothes there for you to select from based on what the clothing manufacturers think most people want. And you buy those and you wear them and they look mostly like the people's clothes around you. And suddenly you look around and it's like, gosh, everybody kind of dresses the same mostly, don't they? How is that happening? Is everybody consciously deciding to dress the same? Not really. But also, we don't really care that much. So that's the thing. It doesn't necessarily matter. And so, yeah, you kind of outsource those decisions. But if they do matter, then you don't want to outsource those decisions. You want to be sure that you've got all your options on the table. And then you'll see it's fun. Like, fashion is a great example because there are the people that really do care about their fashion and they intentionally seek out those options that you're not going to see in the store. You have to go look for them. And it's like, oh, actually, you could dress in a totally different style. There's so many different types of ways to dress, but you have to look for it. And so this is a good example of that, like of seeking options rather than just defaulting to what is the mainstream approach, which, if it's something you don't care about, probably is not important.
Is it a fair interpretation of your view to say that it doesn't matter if you have left wing or right wing or libertarian or communist or whatever political views you might have? The most important thing is that you ended up at those views from a place of curiosity, consideration, and deliberation.
I'm inclined to say yes, but I find that political views often do reflect certain kind of personality traits and ways of thinking. So it's interesting. When I was a communist, I wasn't very curious. And that's part of what led me to that belief system in a way, is that it was so certain and it allowed me to dismiss everything else. And it gave me this kind of like dogmatic power that me being very confused and insecure felt really empowered. And so while yes, in principle, if someone arrives to their beliefs through these intellectual principles of truth-seeking and curiosity, I find that is much more admirable. And you know what? They're probably a better communist for it. They probably know a lot more about their ideology because of it.
Did you grow up with religion at all?
I did. I grew up Catholic, and
I didn't want to assume just because you were Cuban, but
yeah. Well, you'd assume correct. Though my family also practices Santeria, which is like a folkloric Cuban religion that I don't practice. I'm mostly an atheist, not like a staunch militant type atheist, but I don't believe in like a God with pronouns type of thing.
I went through my militant atheist phase in my early 20s, so I can relate.
Yeah, mine was a little younger, likely because of the amount of religion in my life at the time.
Yeah, the reason I ask is like the way that you were describing how someone might arrive or consider themselves to be communist. I noticed a lot of that in the religious circles that I used to run in more when I was in my teens and early 20s, when I was in like Christian youth groups. I grew up Protestant. My dad, being of Irish descent, was Catholic, but then he met my mom and now they are both Protestant. One of the big reasons why I started this podcast years ago is because around 2013, I was with someone who introduced me to critical race theory. I was ahead of the curve, I guess you could say. And I've learned from conversations that I've heard you have that you also similarly, you were talking about things, wokeness, quote unquote, before a lot of your friends had heard of it. And similarly, I'd talk about things relating to CRT in 2013, 2014, 2015 that no one had any idea what they were. And then, of course, a year or two later, they're in the headlines in the New York Times. But what I'm trying to get at here, Salomé, is I noticed a lot of similarities between the circles that I was running in 2013 to 2018 or so, and the experiences that I had as I was starting to struggle with and eventually lose my religion in my late teens, early 20s. And those circles in my religious groups were, staunchly conservative. I don't think I could have found anyone who wasn't voting for George Bush circa 2004 in the circles that I ran with, in the same way that I don't think I could have found anyone in 2013 or so in those circles who would have ever voted for George Bush. So I guess what I'm trying to tease apart here is how much of this either desire to conform or not really thinking through one's principles, how much of that really, if we examine it, is a left-wing phenomenon versus kind of a human phenomenon that can manifest itself wherever?
Oh, I completely agree that it's a human phenomenon. I think that we've just got maybe more attention placed on the left version of it, just because that's what it is right now. I think we have a short memory in some ways because I wasn't alive for much of it, but there was right-wing cancel culture. There was the moral majority in the 80s, and that influence of a kind of like right-wing dogmatic worldview very much was a part of our culture recently. And that alone proves that it's not a uniquely left-wing or right-wing phenomenon to be kind of like dogmatic and pulled into political ideologies that are rigid. It's human. And before it was political, it was religious. It's like people have fought wars for religion for so long. I think that it's reductive to frame that inclination for dogmatism as unique to the left. And it only makes it harder for us to understand it because it's a human phenomenon. And we understand it more broadly if we recognize that. It's also like it's cross culture. It's not like it's unique to Western culture. It's not unique to any time, place, to any particular people in that way. It's something that humans are innately kind of designed to gravitate towards, which is like belief systems and extreme ones, not extremists in the kind of like bomb throwing, but just like black and white and rigid. There's something really satisfying about that for us. And I'm not surprised. I mean, being a human is a crazy experience. To be self-aware and conscious at this level, to know that death is always a possibility for us, to know that the people we love will die, and then to have to like go to work, and still plan for the week. It's kind of insane. So of course we love anything that lets us get wrapped up in this sense of certainty and control. Those are the things that I think we should learn to watch out for more And I think it's unfortunate. I actually think it's unfortunate that people have come to see this tendency towards dogmatism as more uniquely a left-wing thing, because I can already see how on the right, pride cometh before the fall,
Listening to you talk about your experiences in the mid 2010s and how you kind of came out of that, I, again, found a lot of commonality with my own story. And speaking just for myself now, I think that it's difficult to separate the animosity that one can feel for how they felt at that time in that respective group, right? Whether for me it was quote unquote CRT circles, or 2 decades ago, my religious circles and that experience. When I went through my angry atheist phase in my mid 20s, where I was like, there is no God and Christianity sucks and blah, 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 right? I was reacting not only to my discovery, and just speaking for myself here, I know I have listeners who are religious and that's fine, but speaking for my own journey, I just realizing, oh my gosh, I don't believe any of it. That feeling was very visceral, but also that I was reacting to how I was made to feel in those circles when I would go to some of my closest friends. And I'm like, I don't know if I agree with everything that we're worshiping. I have doubts, I have questions. And it was very rare for someone in that group to come to me and say, hey, let's talk about it. It was much more common for them to say, sometimes jokingly, sometimes not so jokingly, that I was a heretic, or that I was an unbeliever, or that I wasn't welcome in those spaces anymore because I was questioning the doctrine. And I got a very similar vibe. I have almost one-to-one stories I could tell you that I'm sure you relate to, Salomé, from my social justice groups in the mid 2010s, where when something wasn't feeling right to me, when something felt that was labeled as social justice, but felt like racism to me, when I would question it, not from a place of being like, hey, let's throw out the baby with the bathwater, but hey, we're all coming from a good place, right? Can we talk about why this feels a little wrong? And both of those environments had a very black and white, to use your phrase, reaction to, you're either with us all the way and you're a Christian, or you're an activist, or you're gone. And it was something that I didn't realize those commonalities between those two things until maybe a couple years ago. And I think for me, it was this realization that it's a human phenomenon of wanting to feel like people are with you, wanting to label, wanting to say you're with us, you're one of us, but also to scorn people and to say, oh, if you're not, pure, then get out. And I went through this period in the late 2010s where I really associated that dynamic specifically with the quote unquote left, or with quote unquote social justice or CRT or whatever. And with some distance now, I'm realizing, feels a little weird to say this publicly because it was a mistake on my part, but I'm realizing that it wasn't specific to that ideology. It is specific to humanity.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's so much more interesting when you make that realization, because it's kind of just like, I see what's happening here. This is a deeper, more universal, more ancient trap than just like, oh, this ideology that came up in like the late 50s or something, or like started to be written at such and such time, or this particular book or this particular doctrine. And it gives you more of a robust defense system against falling into those kind of dogmatic ways of being yourself, if you know that it's not that you only have to avoid that one ideology. You can find it in almost any ideology, because that's where that desire for control and certainty and the sense of like unfallible community, where it's just, we're all on the same page here, guys, right? And doesn't that feel good that we know what's going on and no one's going to come and show us that reality is more complex? That desire for certainty is easy to fall into in like any type of ideology that claims to explain the world for you. And so the freedom for me was partly related to discovering that, because once I realized that my issues with leftism, finding that same kind of environment that you did, where it was like, ooh, this feels kind of cultish. This feels like I'm actually not valued here as an individual. I'm kind of just supposed to be this voice or whatever that people can direct me to say and do what they like at will. And if I show any kind of like, hey, but what about this? I'm a problem. You start to see that kind of behavior. It's the same kind of thing of any destructive collective, any destructive group. It doesn't leave room for inquiry, for individuality, because the ultimate goal at the end of the day is let's protect our monopoly on the truth, even if it requires suppressing the truth. And so once I realized how that functions, like what that pattern of behavior is, I saw it in so many more things. And it is on the right, it is on the left, it is in religion, it's in non-religious groups also. You can have tribalism break out in little communities that are like dedicated to knitting and whatever, where they get gripped by like, you're not agreeing with the thing, like we're making statements around this, you're not doing this, you must be expelled from the knitting Facebook group.
That's not knitting, that's sewing.
Yeah, exactly. It's such an innate human experience to want to like be groupish like that. And so it allows us to have a deeper connection to our beliefs if we don't mix them with dogma. And I think that's the difficulty for a lot of people, is maybe figuring out what that looks like to have beliefs, have values, but not be dogmatic about them, not be tribal about them. And of course, that's difficult because it means that you acknowledge they could be wrong at some point, like that you may have to change your views at some point because you don't have a monopoly on the truth. And it's not a black and white situation where we've got to figure it out and everybody that questions us has nothing and they have no truth or no understanding. It's much more complex than that. I think it's unfortunate that we haven't reached the point of seeing this pattern more. I don't really know why that is. Maybe it's just that I've spent so much time trying to understand it and in some ways become so obsessed with it, hence writing and founding a publication called The Black Sheep, because it's such an innate part of human life. But it unlocks so much when we understand our propensity towards that kind of dogmatism with our beliefs, as opposed to just this more expansive, open way of like, yes, these are my beliefs, but I can tolerate the fact that other people believe different things or want to ask me questions about my beliefs.
You've talked about how when you used to run in those circles, the quote unquote woke or quote unquote social justice circles, that you often felt reduced to the various elements of yourself. You know, the fact that you were a woman or the fact that you were Cuban or a woman of color. And I have similar stories from that period as well. Sometimes it felt like the fact that I was Armenian was more important to people in those groups sometimes than the fact that I was a filmmaker or creative or a nerd or all these other labels and descriptors that would be equally, if not more valid in describing the wholeness of my being. It felt like my surface identity, an identity that was hard for me to even connect to because of how many generations removed I was from the culture. But it seemed like that was the most important thing. And I think that's what really rubbed me the wrong way, because it felt like a whittling down of who I was rather than an expanding of who I was or who I could be. And I do worry, and I want to get your thoughts on this, I do worry that we make the same, we collectively, when we talk about these things, make the same error when we use a phrase like the right or the left. Because if there is a problem, let's say within the left, and we could probably talk for an hour about the various problems that might be affecting the right. But when there is a problem, let's say like identity politics or the worst manifestations of it within the left, I wonder if when we say the left, if we are condemning the entire house when all we need to say is the living room needs to be cleaned. And I wonder if we also potentially could alienate allies. And again, same thing could apply to the right. When we talk about the whole of the politics with a single label, rather than talking about a specific issue within the entire political organization or political ideology, right? Am I making sense here?
Yeah, I've seen what you're describing, and nuance is always important. And I find that there's a propensity to want to paint, whether it's the right or the left, these broad groups that really encompass a lot of different beliefs. I mean, technically, some libertarians are within the right. There's also libertarians that call themselves leftist libertarians. These are really different beliefs within the spectrum of the left and the right. Now, of course, that's likely not who people are referring to when they say the left and the right. But I also think that that's kind of a problem because we should try to be as accurate as possible in our language. A lot of the times I will describe like right-wing collectivists when I'm speaking about behavior that I think is anti-individual and authoritarian on the right, as opposed to just saying the right, because I mean, that could encapsulate a lot of people that really actually do disagree with the behavior that I'm criticizing on the right. You know, it's an interesting thing because it's like, in some ways, we kind of just need to wise up a little bit. You know, it's like, are you talking about liberals? Are you talking about progressives? Are you talking about communists? Like, all of those are different people, and some of them are a lot more reasonable and probably have a lot of overlap with you than others. And so I think that desire to reduce things, right, to be overly simplistic and flatten the complexity of a person or a group or a phenomenon is always like an ever-present threat, because it's so much more satisfying when you can just say, the right is bad. And it's like,
right, yeah.
Nice and black and white and simple. I know exactly who my enemy is and who is not. And the reality is that what we lose in complexity, we then lose as our ability to move more gracefully and skillfully through the world. Because now suddenly I'm writing off this massive amount of people who, some of them really disagree with each other within this group called the right or the left. And when that nuance is really important, it needs to be highlighted. You know, of course, there's the caveat that if we're talking about what actually constitutes the left in terms of the political philosophy that government intervention should be used to engineer more social equality or more kinds of equality of outcome or just certain outcomes, period, that's probably the broadest and most accurate definition you can get when you say, what is the left? Okay, that's kind of what it means to be left. Whereas if you say, what is the right? Okay, these are people that don't generally want to engineer certain outcomes, but do still oftentimes believe in the use of government for other reasons. And so it's like, you can see how when you broaden these descriptions and you try to say like, okay, what actually is the right and the left, it gets a little like meaningless because it's so broad. And so the nuance there is really useful. And I try to do that when I can, when it's relevant, because you really don't want to lump people into a group of like, these are the bad guys, if they aren't the bad guys, because then you're just getting rid of people that you could actually talk to and could be kind of like on the same page with you and be your allies, like you said. And so it's interesting to compare that to the kind of like identity reductionism that identity politics often promote, because I've experienced that too. And that's a weird one. It's got a same element of seeking to simplify the world and seeking to look at the world primarily through groups. It's not your individual characteristics that are most salient, but rather your group characteristics that are more salient. And so those are the ones that then get uplifted in that kind of like identity politics lens. And I think there's something here that's interesting about maybe why that's bad to do in all regards, not just in terms of identity, but like in terms of political affiliation, where it's like, okay, I'm going to imagine that because you view yourself as left-leaning, you fit whatever terrible stereotype I hold about like a communist or something, like, you know, some like really ardently far left person, is that it actually ends up making, again, this like inaccurate worldview where you're looking at the world and you're seeing people in terms of things that are not the most salient characteristics about them. Usually people's political views aren't actually the most salient thing that makes them who they are. I mean, if that were the case, people would be a lot more similar to each other in terms of their politics. And once you start asking questions, they've got a lot of different views, like even within their own groups. And, you know, that's why you have the problem when you have a group that's like, don't ask questions, because it engineers this facade that everybody thinks the same way when that's really not what's going on. And yeah, so I am a believer in adding nuance wherever you can, when it's salient and makes sense. And it's a good instinct to have, right? In some ways, it's kind of a scientific instinct. What is the most important factor here? If I could distill down what it is that I'm talking about that really makes the difference in this phenomenon, how could I distill it? What is the most specific thing here? And so you hear people say a lot like the left is the problem. And it's like, is it though? Is it the left? Is it, like your normal everyday liberal type, your normal Democrats? Or are you talking about people that are very radical or people that have a particular version of leftism? And then once you get into those specifics, you realize, oh, okay, so the problem is actually more manageable. We can see more clearly what the problem is if we try to distill it down into the detailed view, into the nuanced view, as opposed to like leaving it super broad. And it's like, it's all of these people, it's all of that group that's the salient factor, when often that's not the case.
And we, as human beings, we have a love-hate relationship with labels. Because on one hand, we need labels in order to understand the world. Like if you and I can't agree on what a lamp is, or what a chair is, or what a house is, we're never going to get anywhere. We won't even have a language. But on the other hand, it means something totally different to me if I come across someone here in Los Angeles who's ethnically Armenian and they find out I'm Armenian and we share some common, if perhaps in the moment, surface level connection versus someone else, and this actually happened to me, who was of Turkish descent, the only person of Turkish descent who's done this, to be fair, who found out, because my last name is Callahan, so they didn't know this at the time, they eventually found out I was Armenian. And the first thing they said to me, after knowing me for 2 years, the first thing they said when they found out I was Armenian was that the genocide didn't happen.
That's crazy.
But the ways that we like to or resist labels, or the ways that you might have pride in your heritage as a Cuban American, but depending on how that label is used against you, or it's used within the context of a conversation or within a social structure, you're going to feel a different kind of way depending on how that's used, or how the fact that you are a woman or I am a man, how these labels are either used for our benefit or against us, or as a neutral descriptor or as a loaded descriptor. When it comes to something like quote unquote identity politics, again, speaking for myself now, like it was something that I reacted to as I was kind of coming down in the late 2010s and kind of leaving that space, I reacted very harshly to it. But I also realized that for a lot of the people in that space that I was in that social justice space, like they weren't villains. And I'm sure you can probably say the same thing of a lot of your friends in the 2010s, where a lot of the people that I was running with, almost all, and this is a label that I don't particularly enjoy because I think it's flattening, but it's the language we have to use. Most of them were quote unquote people of color. And for them, articulating their identity in a predominantly white society that for a long time has struggled with racism, articulating their identity and what they loved about their identity and how their identity was not something to be ashamed of was very valuable for them. Now, did that manifest then in toxic and rather ironic ways in which they would wield their identity sometimes out of anger or out of spite against other people? Sure. But was there a lot of value in them being able to articulate what they loved about themselves? Yeah. And so it's tricky, right? Like when talking about something like identity politics, because it's never just one thing.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I wish I could know exactly what they said, because I often find that, again, about looking for the nuance and trying to parse things and distill things down to like, what is the core essence here? Of course, there's great things about recognizing what you like about yourself, particularly if it's something that you have thought otherwise about. And then there's also, is it that you have finally found a place where you feel comfortable to do that at all, period? Just to say, actually, I feel good about myself. And it's actually just that is the healthy thing? Or is it in particular, I really needed to think about my worth through the lens of my race or my sex or things like that? Because I found that when I was younger, I mean, this again, it's like so much of this is it's human problems that then get convoluted in ideological issues. I was a very insecure and very confused young person. And so when I found ideologies like feminism and this kind of like identity politics that were like, actually, you can be prideful about these things. It was just like, oh, hell yeah, I'm going to do the opposite now. I'm going to go in the other direction and think that I'm better than other people because I'm a woman, because I'm Cuban American or whatever. Then you have that nasty streak that comes out of identity politics, which is it's often not enough just to say, I'm happy with how I am. It's the next step of, and you're lesser because you're not what I am. And I have this like unique thing now that I have to wield. And so sometimes I think it's complicated and it's hard to parse out because it's so obvious that these ideologies and these practices and these beliefs offer people something that they want. And it's not because they're all evil. Like you're saying, when I was attracted to these beliefs, it wasn't because I was a bad person. On the contrary, I was very idealistic, very much the stereotype of someone that's like, I want the world to be happy. There shouldn't be poverty. Like, why do people suffer? Why can't we just make sure that people have food and housing and all these things? So it is this kind of like genuine care for the problems of the world, but also coupled with my own problems and seeking relief from those. And I think in some ways we really underestimate how much all of these fancy problems are proxies for very simple problems beneath the surface, like feeling inadequate, feeling dissatisfied, feeling insecure. And a lot of the times you see that in the great documentaries and things like that, where people go to extremist groups, whether it's ideological extremists or like racial, like ethno-nationalist extremism, things like that. And you find that sometimes there's something in these people that are attracted to this kind of like extreme ideologies that is sad, that is lost. And they found something that tells them, no, you're great. You're the best, actually. You're so great that you deserve to be treated better than others. You deserve so much more than you've been getting. That's the tricky thing about these kind of ideologies and groups that try to uplift us for characteristics that we haven't necessarily done anything to achieve, is that sometimes they can go too far. And I wonder how much we've lost the plot in just realizing like everybody needs to feel a little okay with themselves. And maybe it's not that hard to do it. Maybe we don't need vast, deep ideologies to say that you're okay the way you are and you should be at peace with yourself. A lot of this, it comes to me, it's like I find myself very torn at times between looking at the world through these political lenses and then looking at them through more of like the Buddhist lens, because sometimes they're so opposed in what they do when they try to solve problems. A lot of political ideology is like, do this, change this, say this, think this, find these people, join this. And the more Buddhist approach is, let go of that. Don't try to become this thing. Just be. And they're so different. One is so much more about like chasing and pursuing and becoming. And the other is much more about doing the exact opposite. And I have found that, especially with feminism for me, feminism was a real tricky one, where in some ways it's a very meaningless word because it's like, which kind of feminism? And what do you mean by that? So I will define that. Like, I'm not talking about first wave feminism, the right to vote. I think that was good. But a lot of the feminist rhetoric now is much more about social issues and just like how we are in society, as opposed to particular legal issues or things of that kind of like tangible problems that can be solved through action. It's more about like, is the male gaze in this movie making it uncomfortable for women to watch this movie also? Like this kind of like critical theory type of mindset that like reads things into things endlessly. And so I found that for me, when I first discovered feminism, it very much just felt like an excuse to overcompensate for my insecurities.
What were you insecure about?
Yeah, good question. It's like I don't even know if it was a specific thing that it was like, oh, I'm insecure about my nose or, that kind of thing. It was more just that I believe I I felt like I needed to prove something, like I wasn't complete.
Was that something that you felt was coming from an outside pressure from someone or a group of people outside of you, or something within yourself that made you feel that way?
I'd say it was within myself because my family definitely didn't contribute to it that much. I'd say they tried their best to constantly just be like, you're the best. We are so proud of you. All of that stuff that you would think would make someone feel confident in themselves. Though there's the risk of overdoing it, right? Where it's like, I better be the best. I better make everybody happy because they said that I'm the best.
Right. You feel like you have to live up to it. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's very much that potential element there. And a lot of it is just normal teenage growing up and starting to see the world around you and starting to compare yourself and thinking like, I want to be liked. I want to be cool. I want to be accepted among my peers. How can I do that? How can I be that? Okay, let me find what are they talking about? What are they wearing? You know, that kind of thing that I think is in some ways a very routine experience for teenagers, particularly teenage girls. And so it was never like this specific thing. It was always just kind of like this vague sense of like, I've got to prove myself. Like I'm about to embarrass myself in some way and I've got to find the next way to show that I'm not lame or embarrassing. You know, it's just funny how simplistic it is. That was very much a thing for me when I was growing up. And it persisted for a while, not in an overt way. In some ways, I think people would consider me confident and I would come off as like a pretty self-assured person. But internally, I very much was like aware of the desire to come off as a confident and self-assured person. So yeah, so I think that an ideology like feminism felt like an excuse to engage in an overcompensating behavior where it was like women are so much better than men because this, that, or the other, we're so wise and peaceful. And if women were the rulers, there would be no war, you know, that kind of thing. That it's just like, well, there's evidence to the contrary, despite how nice that sounds. And also it's just, again, that kind of like reductionist, I can judge people by their identity. And so I think there's something right about like when you're in that insecure mindset where you're worried about being judged yourself, there's some kind of relief in entering into an ideology that tells you, well, you can judge yourself as good. You're good for your identity. Your identity makes you good. And it's like, well, no, that's not right either. Because you could be a really bad woman, you know, like just because you're a woman doesn't make you a good person. And so taking a lot of pride in your identity to the detriment of taking pride in your individual actions and whether you're a good individual is a danger. And I think it can be an escape. And it very much felt like when to me, it was like, oh, okay, I don't need to worry so much about what I'm going to do as an individual. I can do this instead. I can take pride in who I am right now as a identity group, like as a woman, as a Cuban American, as this, that, and the other. And I found these groups that would value you for that. And that was really unique. You know, that was like, as a young person, kind of really seeking that sense of acceptance and dealing with that insecurity, realizing I had these tickets to instant acceptance and praise just because I had this like identity, these certain identities, was like, oh, of course I'm going to cash that in. But then it started to ring hollow as I started to actually develop an individual identity that I took much more pride in because, oh, this is actually me. I am not a woman. Like that doesn't really sum up who I am. That's not what makes me special. That's not why the people in my life love me. That's not what allows me at the highest capacity to do the things that I do as an individual. That's kind of just like an after thing. Like there's certain elements of like, yeah, I like being a woman because this, that, and the other. But if it precedes, if it comes before what I do as an individual, like who I am as an individual, I wonder how much it just, you end up getting into the same trap where you're just perpetuating more of the same insecurity that it's like, I still feel like me as an individual is not good enough. I need to have these markers like, oh, I'm this race, I'm this sex, whatever. And so I think it's a bit of a trap. I don't know. I think everybody needs to kind of like feel a little bit better about themselves. And I agree with that. But I don't know how much these ideologies often, I think it's like, it's again the same problem I had where it's like you think it's going to give you this and then it sidetracks you into something else.
Yes. A lot of what you're describing is a kind of natural, very human manifestation of, how do I word this, Salomé? Megan Down and I were talking about how a descriptor like the quote unquote Black community is, almost meaningless because within the quote unquote Black community, there's as much diversity of thought as there is within any quote unquote race of people or any ethnic group or whatever, right? There's all kinds of political and creative opinions because they contain within them the multitudes of whatever it is to be human, as does anyone else. But that idea of the Black community came out of intense prejudice. That was what created the community in the first place. Like there would be no Black community without white racism because they were labeled as such within the system of white supremacy that existed within America for a long time. And thankfully, we have largely systemically moved past it. But it was an outgrowth and reaction to being labeled as less than for so long. Like the idea of collective action for political and social rights because a person is Black is an outgrowth and reaction to the prejudice that labeled one as less than if they just happen to be born in what was known as a Black body, I suppose you could say. And I think feminism similarly was a reaction to actual oppression. And then it kind of, I think both correctives can overcorrect to kind of get to where you're talking about, which is, well, now it's a bit of an overcorrection and there's pride that you may feel in your identity that is misplaced, even if it was a necessary correction to feeling less than and being labeled less than legally or socially for so long. But it seems like something that humans have to kind of go through, right? Like you fight for equal rights, then maybe you have a misplaced pride in your identity that wasn't justified. But that pride is a reaction to the prejudice that was also based completely on a superficial feature of your identity. You said it very well that like, yeah, I guess there's nothing really that important about the fact that you're a woman. But for most of human history, a lot of men put a lot of importance on whether or not someone was a man or a woman in terms of what they could legally or socially do. And so it's a push and pull that is tough to resolve without going a little bit too far in the other direction sometimes.
Yeah, it's really, really hard. And it's so interesting because to me, I really can't say I've ever felt like a particular oppression as a woman in my lifetime.
Right. Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, I could dig for it.
I imagine some of your older relatives may have, though.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, my grandma wasn't allowed to learn to read because she was a woman, period.
That's wild.
Yeah, that's all. By her own father, he was just like, no, you don't need to learn how to read. You're a woman. That's that. Like, we're going to teach your brothers, not you. And so she would hide in a closet so she could get lessons secretly while they were teaching the sons. So it's like, it's super recent, right? In that way. But in my lifetime, nothing like that. And really, I don't even experience a lot of what you hear feminists talk about today, which I think there is some kind of desire to seek out grievances. And that's a whole different issue, because I think once you tie your identity to a certain kind of cause, well, you need the cause to perpetuate, because if not, what happens to your identity? So very much when I was a feminist, I saw it everywhere. Yeah, I saw the male gaze. I felt uncomfortable all the time. I interpreted things as like sexist, whatever, because I was incentivized by myself and by that ideology to interpret things in that way. Now that I don't consider myself that kind of feminist. I mean, I'd replace that with humanist. I do recognize that there are still problems that women uniquely face, particularly in non-Western countries, and I want those solved. But I want them solved because they're humans, not because women deserve some kind of special treatment or whatever. These are women's issues, and we can look at them through that true lens. But the reality is that humans all deserve to be treated equally and to be given their freedom. And so at the end of the day, like, my goals are the same as feminists. I just don't keep it in that lens of like, this is because of patriarchy only or whatever, because it's like you'll find the same kind of problems crop up in different formats, because it's ultimately not just about sexism or racism. It's about the normal human propensity for prejudice and to subjugate others to gain a sense of control for yourself. And that's, again, this like universal human problem. And sometimes if we get too specific on like, oh, it's a feminist problem, it can blind us to like how much more universal and ancient the problem is than just the ideology that claims to solve it. And so the problem with a lot of these things, like as you described, that the reinforcement of identity is often born out of a denigration of that identity. That is incredibly true. And it's a problem because it becomes this cycle. Because the thing is, like you see with a lot of feminism now, there is a point at which you become the thing that you were once fighting against, where now you have taken so much pride in your identity, and that often leads to denigrating others. You have this like rhetoric in feminists where it's like, oh, men are all like inherently sexist, men are dangerous, like all these things like that, because it's a tool to uplift women and to form a connection for the group, which is like, we all know who the bad guys are. It's men. Yes. Okay. We're all on the same page. And so that kind of like collective bonding around identity often requires the identification of an out group that everybody in the in group recognizes as like, yes, they are the out group. No good. We all agree on that. That's how we police the identity that is the group. And so you have this feedback loop where it's like, okay, we're just righting the wrongs of the past by taking pride in our identity today, because in the past it was denigrated. Well, at what point do you reach the final limit where it's like, we no longer need to take pride in this identity? And if we do, we run the risk of now repeating the cycle where we're saying we're better than others because of our identity, and that identity is an important and salient factor that people should pay attention to, when that was the very kind of mindset that led us to need to feel pride in our identity to compensate for those harms in the past. And that's really the issue with like the difference between a kind of like individual appreciation for one's culture and like how that's informed you as an individual and the influences, and that kind of expansive approach to it where it's like, yeah, I appreciate things in my culture, just like I appreciate things in other cultures too, right? It's not that it's uniquely better or something, or that I have to like deeply identify with it, but that it's a beautiful thing that's produced important things in my life. And the line with that of not going into the other side of where it just becomes identity politics. And yeah, you might have a great reason for engaging those identity politics, but it's still bad for you in the long run. Because at the end of the day, a lot of it revolves around these stereotypical views of oneself, right? So we're talking about like the idea of like, what even is the Black community? And this really, it's like a sad thing, because you're so right that there's so much of this like warranted desire to take pride in identity after so much of the opposite treatment over identity. But then you find that it becomes just a new kind of box where it's like, oh, you're not acting Black. You're a pick-me woman because you're not a feminist. And I've had the same thing with Cuban identity, where it was like, I felt the need to act more Cuban, to act more Latin, so that I could fit into these groups that cared about the quote unquote Latin community.
I felt the same way. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and that's the thing about that box of like collective identity, is that it can end up becoming a trap where we feel like, oh, am I not part of this because I don't fit what we're calling Latin identity or what we're calling whatever this group is? And so in some ways, I went through the individual journey of being very insecure as a person, finding ideologies that told me my identity was important and that I could take pride in that, taking pride in that and getting some short relief from it, then ultimately finding that it was leading me to create division in my own life, where I was engaging in that kind of judgment of people for their identity because I was judging myself for my identity, although it was in the positive. It's still a practice of believing that identity is an important factor by which to judge. And I believe that the direction we should be going in is ultimately to start lessening the importance of identity as something that we use to understand individuals by, because it's usually the individual themselves can show you a lot more about who they are than like, oh, I know a lot about you because you're a woman or you're Cuban. And it's like, you probably don't. That's probably not going to give you enough. I mean, you can figure out my cuisine or whatever, like what my body is. But beyond that, it doesn't account for a lot of my beliefs and my experiences and my opinions and things like that. And so in that way, it was when I finally got to a point where I was like, oh, I don't need this anymore. I don't need to cling on to these group identity markers as a source of pride and for a sense of who I am. I know who I am. I'm an individual. I know what I believe now. I don't need this box that I can take and get like a ready-made identity from. I can make my own identity. Ever since I developed that kind of freedom where I didn't feel like I needed to pander to whatever people thought what it was to be a woman or what it was to be Cuban American or things like that. Once I felt like, no, actually, those are not really important factors for understanding who I am and for engaging with me. And they shouldn't inform how you treat me either, really. It allowed me to go like way deeper in my development of my personality and do so based off of beliefs, like principles, actual ideas, as opposed to just like this more superficial thing of I care about what the Latin American community cares about, or I care about what the woman community cares about, you know? Like I developed my own identity instead of relying on those.
And on the individual level, one of the biggest problems with labels is that it freezes you at a specific moment in time. Like if I had come across you in 2013, I would have come across in many ways a completely different person, but a person who had to go what you went through to get to where you are today. And if I had just frozen you in time in 2013 and labeled you with labels that you would have agreed to, those labels would be inaccurate in 2024. And that applies to all of us, right? And I think the mistake that we make too often, whether it's a political label, cultural label, or otherwise, is when we label someone, we make them that thing forever in our minds, and we disallow them the growth that all of us experience day to day, week to week, year to year.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's just what I love about the concept of individuality, because it can encompass all of that. It can encompass the normal human process of being ever changing. And I think it's something that we're in danger of losing more and more because of social media, because we're much more inclined to look at people as static images of whatever we happen to discover from them. It's so funny, like the whole phenomenon of digging up old posts and then wanting someone to answer for those like 5 years later. It's like, if you dug up my old posts, first of all, I don't think they can get me canceled because they're all like left wing. So right now, that's usually the safer old opinions to have. Like I guess they could get me canceled among right-wing people, but who cares? And it's just like, yeah, that's not me. You know, there's so many things that when I was younger, I don't believe anymore. It's just like I was a different person. And I think it's sad that we don't think about that as much. We don't think about like the way we flatten people and remove the idea of growth, the reality of change from the human experience when we think of people as these static labels. And of course, there's influences for why we do that, because it's not always very common that people change their opinions on like really deep moral beliefs or political beliefs. And yet people do. And so that's the most beautiful thing. And in some ways, if we could account for that more in the way we talk to and about each other, maybe just the acknowledgement that that is an ever-present reality would help people to feel more inclined to be open-minded and to consider change, whether for themselves or for others instead of treating people like they're static and thus disposable if you don't agree with them in that moment. It's really kind of like a flattened, uglier way to think about humans. It's nice to think about the fact that we're all capable of change.
In one sentence, or you know what? I'll give you two. How would you describe the person you aspire to become?
I aspire to be a person driven, a human, a deeply human driven by hope, able to channel love more often than I am, curious and courageous enough to embrace the unknown, the complexities of life, and to find the joy of being alive while doing what often feels like very chaotic navigating.
Salomé, I appreciate your perspective, your ability to challenge not only others, but yourself. And today, most of all, I appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you so much.